Hold on, Daniel. Would you ever shoot video on a Nikon?
No.
Why? Okay, here's the deal. Hardly any professional filmmakers shoot Nikon. It's just the truth.
How dare you!
There might be a few here and there, but most don't. If you search online which is the best video camera to buy, you'll see forums and discussions and videos, and it's always Canon, Sony, Blackmagic, but Nikon is never on the list. Yet, nobody knows exactly why. I mean, some of the newer Nikon cameras shoot 12-bit RAW, 4K 60 frames per second, and many of the standard specs that we would typically see out of a high-end Sony or Canon camera. Yet, when we asked everyone if they would shoot Nikon for video, they all said no, but none of them knew why. Would you ever shoot video with a Nikon?
What?
Back when DSLRs started coming out with video, the biggest debate was Canon versus Nikon. Which one do you use? I remember Googling this all the time, but now, if you see someone shooting video and they say they're using a Nikon, you look at them like they're insane. Why does nobody use Nikon for video? These are the questions I have been asking myself recently, and the same questions that I want to present to you today. Is Nikon a viable option for filmmakers today? Is Nikon back in the filmmaking game with their new Z9? Now, Nikon was extremely generous in sending us a Z9 to try out and review so that we can answer these very questions. I got to use this camera for both video and photo work over the last few weeks, and I'm asking you and myself a very serious question. Is Nikon making a comeback? But before we jump into really looking at what this camera has to offer, I wanted to let you guys know that I actually love Nikon. Nikon was the first camera brand I ever used, and I loved learning about photography like 6 years ago with my dad's old Nikon D40. It had like 6 megapixels, and I loved it because it was what I had. Eventually, I started learning more and growing in my craft, and so I upgraded to the D700, which was my first full frame camera. And then I decided I wanted to go and upgrade again, so I got the D750. This was my main camera for years, and a lot of my favorite photos I've ever taken were actually taken on that camera. However, when I started to get more into video, I started to notice that everybody around me was shooting something else. Some had just jumped on the Sony train, but most people around me were shooting Canon, maybe even Panasonic. And even though my D750 could shoot video in 1080p, it seemed as though the people around me had cameras around the same price as mine, but theirs just had so much more to offer. I tried to just not think much about it and keep using my Nikon because I love shooting with it. However, when I wanted to shoot more video, I decided to switch to another company that my friends were using for video. So I switched to using Lumix and Canon as my main camera bodies and left my Nikon behind and sold it with all my other Nikon gear because it just wasn't able to do what I needed it to do. Every once in a while, I still miss it because I loved using it for photography and it had really good dynamic range, but my Lumix G9 shot 4K 60 and had pretty good autofocus for photography and was pretty decent with still images, so that's what I've been using for the last couple of years after making the jump into starting to do more video work. But after using this new Nikon for a little bit, I'm starting to wonder if Nikon is actually back in the game. I haven't used Nikon in a couple of years, and I know that they've had their Z series out for a little bit, and I've never really given them a solid chance, but after using the Z9 for the last week or two, it's safe to say that Nikon has listened to the reviews and customers and has finally made a piece of gear that actually stands up to the competition of everybody else on the market. I know, it sounds crazy to even think of a Nikon camera standing toe-to-toe with a Canon R5 or something like that, but it's happening. This camera has incredible specs, like 46 megapixels inside of a mirrorless body that shoots 4K at not only 60 frames per second, but also 120 frames per second, and this camera currently can shoot in 8K 12-bit RAW. In a Nikon? So, this video is not necessarily a camera review like 25 things about this camera that you should know about or anything like that. Of course, we're going to talk about this camera and my experience while using it over the last couple of weeks, but the real goal of this video is, again, to answer the question when it comes to video, is Nikon a viable contender in a world of Canon, Sony, and Blackmagics? I was able to shoot with the Z9 at church, on the beach, with my parents, at a skate park with some friends, and I really got to put my hands on this camera and see how it works in the real world. And just in case I wasn't already convinced, we actually put it side by side next to the Canon 1DX Mark II, which is a little bit of an older camera, but it's around the same price point. We wanted to see how this Nikon camera would compare to what's already on the market. So, first off, let's just talk about the build of this camera. It's pretty big in size, so that could be a turn off for some people, but I have to say, when using it and holding it for long periods of time, I actually found it to be very comfortable in my hands. I would compare it to something like the Canon 1DX. You don't need a battery grip for this camera, it already comes with a battery grip built in. The LCD screen on the back doesn't fully articulate like the Canon R5 and the R6 cameras, but it does do pretty much everything else except flip around. It tilts up and down, side to side, just like how you would need it to. And at first, I didn't like this, but the more I used it, the more I really enjoyed it. There really was never an angle I was shooting at where I couldn't see the screen. I first used this camera on a Sunday morning to capture some video content of them leading worship. The lighting was a little dim, and I have to say, it held up really well. I shot everything in a flat picture profile just so I could have a little bit more room to edit the colors afterwards, and I won't lie, it actually focused much better than I thought it would, and I really enjoyed using it. And now that I'm thinking about it, this is actually the first time in years that I've ever recorded video on a Nikon camera. Like, it's been a really long time. And I'm really pleased to say that it definitely held up to what I've been using with Canon and Panasonic cameras, as well as Sony. This camera was able to do exactly what I needed it to do while on the job. It focused from subject to subject with ease, and the stabilization was much better than I thought it was going to be. Nikon also sent us a 24-70 f2.8 zoom lens, as well as an 85 f1.8 lens, and so these are the two lenses that I've been using, and they're both very fast, sharp, and hold up quite nicely. Usually in this kind of environment, when lights are moving rapidly and it's already pretty dark, sometimes cameras have a difficult time focusing on the right thing or hunting for the subject because of the lack of light. For all of this footage, I shot in autofocus to see how well it worked. Now, I do want to say one thing about the Nikon autofocus. I never have been so confused in my entire life with a camera setting. A couple of days before I shot at church, I went to a parking deck with a friend of mine, and we were going to compare the Z9 to the Canon 1DX Mark II, and I won't lie, it literally took us 45 minutes to figure out why the Nikon wasn't focusing continuously. Bro, the Nikon's literally not focusing. Why is it doing that? We had it set to continuous autofocus, and it wasn't continuously autofocusing. It took me, no joke, 45 minutes to realize that to get this camera to actually focus continuously while recording video, you have to be in full-time focus mode, not continuous focus mode. So this little nugget of information is going to save you almost an hour of searching if you do get this camera. I can see this being very confusing for the average person that might pick this camera up and stick it in continuous autofocus mode and get just as annoyed as I was trying to figure out why this camera won't focus while recording unless you half press the shutter. But once I figured it out and we set it to full-time autofocus, I was very surprised. We ended up redoing all these tests because we couldn't figure it out the first time, and so this time we just went into the backyard and put the Nikon Z9 up against the Canon 1DX Mark II, and they both focused just as good as one another. The Nikon actually surpassing the Canon when it came to focusing on faces. We did a test of raising a hand to see the change in focus, and the Canon was faster to focus on the hand rising up, but the Nikon was actually much quicker in finding someone's eyes and locking that focus in. Yeah, when you put your hands up, the Canon's way faster. And then put it down, and then, yeah, that's weird, isn't it?
That is,
You put your hands up, and
boom.
The Canon's like boom, and Nikon's still focusing and focus, and then let go. Nikon, Canon. Yeah. That's literally the difference in fast. That's crazy. We shot both of these two cameras in a standard picture profile, and the Nikon seemed to have just a slightly more punchy look to it, while the Canon was just a little bit more flat, but honestly, both of them looked great. It was good to finally see a Nikon camera actually compete with a Canon camera when it comes to video. We did a couple of tests with both cameras just to see how the focus went up against each other, and like I said, it was a pretty even fight, and both of these cameras did pretty well here. We also tested the skin tones to see which camera would look the best, and honestly, looking at them side by side, they both look almost identical. The Canon might just be the slightest bit warmer, but nothing crazy. We've done skin tone tests before with other cameras, and usually one is more pink or yellow than the other, but both of these looked really good. If we were to put them side by side and ask you to choose which one is the Canon and which one is the Nikon, it would actually be really difficult. There really isn't much to say about either one because honestly, they both look fantastic here. Now, it's one thing to do a test like this, comparing it outside in a controlled environment, but it's a whole other thing to actually go out and test this camera out on the job. So, We went to a local skate park with a couple of friends and had them just kind of skate around. We wanted to see how the Nikon would hold up, focusing with a moving subject at a pretty good speed. If you watched our one wheel video on this channel, you'll notice I didn't ride it at all, and that's simply because I cannot ride the one wheel, and definitely can't ride and film at the same time. So Justice got some really cool shots following the skaters, and there were a couple of times where it wouldn't quite pick up focus perfectly, but most of the time it focused on them, and when the camera did pick up focus and lock on, it worked really, really well. Now, one other thing I wanted to test out was this camera's low light. Now, it's not a secret, Sony is the best when it comes to low light, but I really wanted to see how the Nikon would hold up as well. I went on a walk on the beach with my parents at sunrise and got to really test this thing out. At low ISOs from 400 to 3200, the camera looked great. Of course, like any other camera in the world, the more you raise the ISO, the more grain you'll start adding to your image, and this camera definitely didn't do as well with this as I thought it might, but it still was very, very usable. And let's be real, most of the time you never need to go above ISO 6400 for most standard shoots, so honestly, I think this camera did just fine for what you'd probably need it for. It might not be the best in low light, but for all the standard shooting you'll be doing, it works great. After using the camera for a while and comparing it to others, honestly, this camera actually exceeded my expectations in almost every category. The autofocus, once we figured it out, was great. Skin tones were great. The screen, the ease of use, the resolution, it's all really great. So to answer a few of the main questions, surprisingly, yes. I do think that Nikon is a solid contender for filmmakers. When you're looking at a brand new camera to purchase, Nikon should definitely show up on your list, and I genuinely believe that they have made a comeback when it comes to video. Now, I also want to ask you another question you're probably asking yourself, and that is, where does it come in on a list of other cameras? Where does it compare to Sony and Canon and stuff like that? And I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think the best way to categorize the Z9 is to say that this camera isn't necessarily the best at anything, but what I think this camera does excel at is being the best at being able to do everything pretty darn well. Now, what do I mean by that? Let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, and don't get offended by my scale, okay? I'm just trying to illustrate this. The new Canon R3 or R5C or whatever Canon camera you'd like to choose, they shoot incredible video and incredible photography. Professional photographers use them all the time. Professional filmmakers, they love it. So let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 6 with video and an 8 with photography. Again, not that it's bad or low quality or anything, this is just an illustration. Sony, on the other hand, does incredible videos and photography, and I'd say I love shooting video on Sony, but if I was going to do photography, I'd probably grab my Canon. So I'd say Sony is an 8 with video and a 6 with photography. You could keep adding more cameras to the list, but when it comes to the Nikon Z9, I would say it's a solid 7 with video, incredible footage, 8K RAW, fantastic, and a solid 7 with photography. I love taking pictures on a Nikon, and I think it's great. So it's not the greatest in either category, but it's fantastic at doing both very, very well. So who exactly is this camera for? If you're in a role where you kind of have your hands in a lot of different areas like video work, photo work, and you do both just as much as the other, this camera is literally perfect for you. At the time of recording this video, the Nikon is probably the best on the market even. If you're looking for a camera that's really good at doing everything, this one's hard to beat. If on the other hand you want to focus more on video than photography and want something that is the best at one of these things, maybe a Canon C70 would be better or something like that. But if you're going to want to go to every shoot and do work for any client, feeling like the tool in your hand is more than enough to get the job done, whatever it is, from weddings, portrait shoots, even interviews and commercials, this camera would be everything you need, maybe even more. We would highly recommend the Nikon Z9. And I can't believe I'm even saying this, but I do believe that Nikon has finally made a comeback and is something to be considered when choosing your next camera. As always, if you're starting to dive into videography work and photography work, or really anything in the industry, you're probably starting to realize that a lot of cameras are really expensive, and so is the gear you need to use with it. That's why at tomorrowsfilmmakers.com, we have over 1,200 training videos and over 100 hours of content on every single aspect of filmmaking you can possibly imagine, literally just for $97. This course has allowed over 20,000 filmmakers just like you to learn all the skills they need while still being able to afford all the gear they need. So If you want to learn everything about filmmaking, check out tomorrowsfilmmakers.com and learn all the skills that you need from leading professionals in the industry. So, guys, I hope you've really enjoyed this video, and I hope that it's maybe changed your mind a little bit when you consider Nikon. I know it has for us. If I see a filmmaker using a Nikon to shoot video, I will no longer wonder why, but I will know that that filmmaker made a really good decision.